14, you watch videos of people on YouTube reacting to f***ing YouTube.
Welcome to ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy. Rick and Morty is back in an episode that is filled with Easter eggs, references, and lots of hidden meanings. So many hidden meanings that it gets pretty confusing at times. Luckily, I'm here to explain all of this symbolism to you. The episode's title is The Never Rick and Morty. This is a play on the movie The Never Ending Story, which, like this episode, is a pretty meta storyline. It's a book turned into a movie about a kid reading a book. He begins to affect the story and ends up saving the characters in the book by interacting with them. And, as a reward, he gets to bring the book characters into the real world. This has many parallels with this episode that I'll delve into as we go. We have a lot to cover. When Dan Harmon and Jeff Loveness began writing this episode, they were trying to create an anthology story, several self-contained stories that existed within a common narrative thread, like all of Rick's exes telling stories about him. Problem is, Rick, the character, seemed too intelligent to exist within that kind of story. The writers were being true to the character and realized that Rick would just become bored with this premise and start to find ways around it.
I don't accept your weird leap in logic that has everyone on a train going to kill one guy, and even if I did, why would we take turns telling stories about it like little girls at a sleepover?
There have been several Rick and Morty episodes where Rick breaks the fourth wall.
We'll be right back.
This Rick not only knows he's in a TV show, he's mastered the storytelling structure that he exists within. That structure is called the story wheel. Dan Harmon, the series co-creator, has been using this method for years. It's so ubiquitous in the writing community that there's even a gag about it in The Simpsons.
TV must be a circle. Ow!
The story wheel is modeled after Joseph Campbell's monomyth, The Hero's Journey. Basically, Campbell says that every hero's story obeys the same structure. Harmon tweaked this to create 8 steps. A character is safe, they want something, they enter an unfamiliar situation, they adapt, they get what they want, pay a heavy price, return to the familiar situation, and then they have changed.
We don't have to do anything, Morty. This is just a structural guide. We're obviously going to impart our own style.
The story circle is a blueprint for a never-ending supply of stories. See what I did there? I'm sure you noticed that these story guidelines are used by Rick to navigate through this adventure.
Here's where the stupid vignettes were.
The vignettes he's referring to are the standalone anthology stories that we see glimpses of. When he says,
God, imagine if that had been the whole thing.
It's a rip on shows like Family Guy, who exist to make one string of gags after another.
Remember the time I sang La Cucaracha for Paul McCartney? Yep!
The episode is structured to show Rick and Morty passing through a train, much like the movie Snowpiercer. Both that film and this episode end up being metaphors for capitalism. And, by the way, just to emphasize how much this train is controlled by the story circle, every door has a ship's wheel above it, with handles marking each threshold of the story wheel. This is showing that as the characters move through the train, they're passing through different phases of this circle. The first car is a CD bar. Notice the weapons embedded in the bar and walls, bullet holes, a wanted poster, and the wooden planks on the windows. This beer tap says Killer IPA, and it's shaped like the hitman Crembopulus Michael. And this other one looks like a venomous snake from Rattlestar Rick Lactica. Everybody here is a villain with the same goal.
There's only one creature worth killing. The man in the white coat.
This is a parody of the Batman animated series anthology episode Almost Got Him, where Batman's villains meet up to tell stories about the Caped Crusader. This whole episode is a meditation on the act of writing, and there are lots of in-jokes for writers weaved throughout the story. The opening story even sounds like an opening pitch in a writer's room.
Mine begins on planet Ramamama.
There's a generic villain from a placeholder name. When Rick pitches him fart jokes, he replies with,
All right, this is going in circles.
foreshadowing how important circles are in this episode. But it turns out the villain isn't angry at Rick because he broke into his castle, but because he didn't tell the story correctly.
Anyway, he tells a different version of the story where I start crying or something. That's why he has to die.
The clam lady even begins her story like she's reading a screenplay.
Dissolve to a clam-shaped sun rising over a giant beach.
The next car is Christmas themed, another sound premise for self-contained anthology storytelling. It also calls to mind the Polar Express, the wonderful children's Christmas story set on a train. Oh my God, what is that? Get out for the... Anyways, Goombie tells the story of Rick not inviting him inside for Christmas. Now this is an old trope seen in movies like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and The Green Book. But here, Rick repeats how he treated Jerry during his separation with Beth.
Stay strong, Jerry. I believe in you.
And then we see the Rick X's car. Notice the Black Widow carpet on the floor and the blue hearts pierced by daggers to symbolize their broken relationships. This X looks like Yaddle, the female of Yoda's species who sat on the Jedi Council in The Phantom Menace. There's also a 3-breasted woman, another series nod to Total Recall. The Ice Queen is a neat reference to the Chronicles of Narnia, which featured a similar queen who was played by Tilda Swinton, who was also in Snowpiercer. This guy looks like Aldrich from Dark Souls, and these are Elsa and Anna from Frozen. The interlude is broken up by my favorite joke of the episode.
I am the concept of time.
So why does the concept of time break them away from this side story? Because there's a limited number of minutes in the episode and we have to keep the story moving forward. So now let's talk about Tickets Please Man, who is a riff on this character from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Tickets, please.
Within the story, he represents an obstacle for them to overcome. Speaking of overcome,
He's got those things. What do you call them? The gutter.
in fact, every major obstacle in this episode uses the same gross metaphor for overcoming. When a hole is burst in the wall, he creates a breach in continuity. Continuity means that everything in your story is connected and obeys certain structural rules. That's why when the structure of the story is broken, the continuity no longer makes sense and the characters become disconnected from reality. For instance, if we were to break the continuity of this video essay, and actually the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is a fascinating story. Gavrilo Principe, a member of the Black Hand, thought he was For instance, when Tickets Please guy leaves the structure of the story, he becomes uncertain of his reality. Later, Rick says,
He's suspended in disbelief, slowly dying while living out an alternative non-diegetic reality.
Diegetic essentially means part of the story. The only purpose of Tickets Please Man is to collect tickets.
Tickets, please.
He still has this core tenet, but he can't act on it, so he goes insane.
Give me your tickets. I need tickets. Everyone give me tickets!
It's like Tickets Please Man is the concept of a character who still exists, but he no longer has a story to work within. So to illustrate this, the writers bring back the simulation arcade machine from Morty Night Run. Morty played a similar game, Roy Life Well Lived, and afterwards he was uncertain of his reality.
Where's my wife? Morty.
These simulations show what happens when a writer becomes so ingrained in the story they're telling that they lose track of themselves, just like Tickets Please Man shifts in and out of different realities. The train police show up, kind of like the story police trying to keep the plot moving. Entering a scene with a gun is also a very cliche writing technique to drive a story forward. They say,
Too soon!
Too soon! Don't move! Too soon!
which is another comedy writing term for making fun of a disaster too soon after it's happened. After they detonate a canister of continuity, the story's continuity is broken, and it turns out that all of this exists inside a training video, kind of like the trope of revealing that it was a dream the whole time. But because continuity was broken, Rick and Morty are able to suddenly appear in the scene. One of the cops says,
If there was a continuity explosion, isn't there always one? And doesn't that mean those two could be anywhere?
This is because once you break continuity, then continuity no longer matters. Once the rules of reality have been broken, anything is possible. For instance, Rick and Morty pop up into the scene. Rick's leg is healed, much like a Looney Tunes character's injuries are erased after every gag. Then, Rick calmly lays out the story structure of the episode, right down to the conflicts they'll face.
I'll have to rig us a couple of spacesuits that start failing around here so we can pay a heavy price for re-entering at this threshold.
Also, notice that even the recycling bins are adorned with circles. When Rick makes another crack about Tickets Please Man, he and Morty talk like writers who are very pleased with themselves.
Because you're naturally funny. You know, that's good old-fashioned fun right there, you know? We don't need to overthink shit, okay? Okay, buddy.
Rick promises to move away from meta storytelling, but then consciously moves us into a commercial break.
Going into an act break.
Come home to the impossible flavor of your own completion. Come home to simple rigs.
Then we come back to a bird-person musical number very much like the ending of the never-ending story. It turns out that we're in a musical car, which is also a pretty good setting for an anthology plotline. There's plenty of Easter eggs here with musical theater characters. There's Tracy Turnblatt from Hairspray, a character from Rent, Donkey from Shrek, the Phantom of the Opera, Shakespeare, a cat from Oh My God, what is that? And on the wall there's parody posters from Phantom, Cats, and The Sound of Music. And here you can see musical moments from past episodes like TR's song, Get Swifty, and Fart. Then we see the Tickets Please guy bleeding all over his false reality, but he's attracting fans. This is a metaphor for the one-off Rick and Morty characters like Snuffles or Pickle Rick who attract fan bases on the internet. For instance, this guy worships Tickets Please Man and refuses sex so he can concentrate on his obsession. As soon as he finds another interest, in this case sex, his attention is diverted and his reality ends. Just like Rick and Morty nerds may obsess over every little detail in an episode and make YouTube videos about it, but when they get a girlfriend, they move on to something else. This reality dies when Morty blows holes in this miniature continuity, like a critic pointing out story flaws is blowing holes in the story. And this
Cutesy name news, I'm Uncle Nibbles.
is another writing gag. When you're writing a comedy script, you often insert placeholders like funny line here or cutesy name news, but this placeholder name stayed in.
I know Extreme Sport Punk #1.
Rick placed ticking clocks on their suits, which are another storytelling device to drive a plot forward.
Why would you put ticking clocks? Because if it's too easy to get there, we'll never get there.
Without pressure, characters tend to wait around and just talk to one another without any kind of motivation. Their goal is to enter the engine and control their own story. But first, they encounter a portal which Rick calls the thematic seal. Thematic means relating to a story or a structure. Therefore, to break this seal and control their own story, they have to first exist outside of this story. In Morty's first story, notice this picture of Morty Jr. here, showing that he still thinks about his son. His second story follows the Bechdel Test.
Two women, They both have to have names and talk to each other about something. Rick! Other than a man.
Which was really Alison Bechdel's sarcastic take on how very few stories are written about women. But for some reason, male writers took her seriously and actually think this is a good metric for equality. But as Morty proves, it's a terrible storytelling framework. For instance, Harry Potter doesn't pass the Bechdel test. Morty's story is feminism for feminism's sake, and even appropriates a feminist icon, the notorious RBG. Also, notice how the lady scorpions have bows and long eyelashes, but are otherwise indistinguishable from the males, kind of like Mickey and Minnie Mouse. This is commenting that oftentimes male writers don't really write parts for women, they just write parts for men and change the names. And this line,
guess who's got 2 penises and all the agency,
is saying that Rick and Morty can include storylines about Beth or Summer, but it's always going to be a show driven by 2 dudes.
Rick and Morty forever 100 times.
At the front of the car, they meet the story lord, the person driving the train, who I think is a metaphor for one of the writers, Dan Harmon. He even kind of looks like Harmon, but with bleh. Notice how his uniform is covered in circles, and so is his layer, hitting home that this guy is the embodiment of the story circle. His layer also seems modeled after the engineer car in Snowpiercer, and it's filled with booze and books, the perfect writer's room. When he rips off his shirt, he says,
Oh, is this a double beat? Oh, well, just how I adventure, dog.
A beat is like a storytelling joke in comedy scripts, and while he does repeat this beat from earlier, at least he escalated the situation by presenting them with a bigger obstacle to overcome.
You are like 90% gutter.
As they burst from the train, they enter adventures outside of the continuity, but each time they leave the continuity, they enter a different one that treats their story like a simulation, much like what happened to Tickets Please Man. Like Morty escaping a Matrix-like pod in the Citadel, or the idea that the whole thing is a Vietnam vet drug trip like in Jacob's Ladder, or that Rick is actually a wormhole scientist at a university with a different teen sidekick. They drink at a bar with farts on tap and a Michael Jordan jersey on the wall. And this also felt like a riff on Back to the Future, like the Doc and Marty short that inspired Rick and Morty to begin with. Anyways, everything outside the train isn't in continuity, so it doesn't matter.
It's not real. Nothing's real.
Story Lord binds Rick and Morty in positions like they're being crucified, foreshadowing for later. And he says,
Beyond the 5th wall.
A 4th wall break is when the characters address the audience.
Oh!
As Rick does all the time.
I want that Mulan McNugget sauce, Morty. That's my series arc, Morty.
The 4th wall refers to the invisible wall of a stage set or a TV screen. But a 5th wall break is when a character acknowledges that they're being played by an actor, or that they exist in our reality.
I'm working for Mel Brooks. Not in the face.
So the 5th wall is the wall around the audience that holds us in our world. Now remember that for later. Storylord's machine is basically an engine to create a profitable TV show. It's composed of narrative energy and story potential that feed into marketability, broad appeal, and relatability. These are the metrics that a studio executive uses to determine if a show will make them money. Now notice there is no spot for character. So when the Storylord is drawing away their potential storylines, he's doing so at the cost of character. Sure, you can construct a story with all the Rick and Morty fan service you want, but if it's not true to character, then it's going to suck. So, how do they fight back? By advancing their characters forward, sending Summer off to college, tearing up.
It's a human moment, Morty. It's a human moment.
But the need for fan service will not die. We get a flood of Easter eggs and audience dream episodes like Snuffles fighting cats on a dog planet and the return of Tammy, Phoenix Person, Aberdolf Linkler, and finally giving the party kid an expanded role. This is a battle for the very soul of Rick and Morty. Will the show put character first or squander character with a bunch of one-off anthology stories? Rick says,
resist before he burns us out!
Because writers have to fight burnout and find new ways to keep their characters fresh. They flash to the series finale of the show, a parody of The Long Night, with evil Morty leading an army of Ricks dressed like Doctor Who Time Lords, Meeseeks, Gazorpazorps, and an evil Mr. Poopy Butthole. This seems hopeless for Rick and Morty because this is the story that we actually all want to see, so there's no way that our characters won't be swallowed by this massive story. But then, they give their show a religious message.
Jesus is always knocking at the door. All we have to do is open it and let him into our hearts.
Which offends people who are religious and people who aren't. It ruins the mass appeal of the product. So now they've been reduced to Christian children's fiction like VeggieTales. Any kind of storytelling with an ulterior goal always fails, whether it serves a religion like VeggieTales or commercials which only exist to generate revenue.
Get him!
Grandpa, what's going on?
Pringles! We're trapped in a Pringles commercial. They must have taken us in our sleep.
How can we...
Without character, all stories fall apart. To illustrate that Jesus is the biggest story obstacle that needs to be overcome, he has the largest, Jesus was also foreshadowed by this line.
Jesus, the tickets please guy is cut!
But then they revealed that they're actually inside a product, a toy from the Citadel of Rick's gift shop. So nothing in the story matters because the story only exists to make money.
Your only purpose in life is to buy and consume merchandise, and you did it.
The story lord explains to Jesus that his life is just another story that's been told and interpreted throughout the centuries. Then Jesus transcends and fires blood from his waist like Tickets Please Man. This shows that he's leaving this reality for another one, maybe one where there is a literal Jesus and a literal heaven who's not a cartoon character making money for Warner Brothers Television. This twist is just too weird, and it makes the story run off the rails, ending this reality once and for all. The end scene is also a parody of the short story Footprints, where the narrator talks to Jesus on a beach. And this incantation,
Father of Omens, give me blood beyond sight,
is a reference to Lion-O's Sword of Omens in Thundercats.
Sword of Omens, give me sight beyond sight.
Then Rick says,
nobody's out there shopping with this virus.
And that is the fifth wall break that I mentioned earlier. Rick has now joined us in our reality. I also think this post-credits tag for the toy train would have aired in the Citadel of Rick's, much like the Simple Rick commercial we saw last season. And this line,
Are they alive? Of course, but not in any ways that matter.
They have no soul.
means that they do exist, but only as creations. They have no agency, except what the writers give them in the service of capitalism. Commercialism is an endless cycle.
Pringles make endless new flavors!
Creators create, then we buy, which gives the creators money to create more. And so on and so on. It's an endless, looping cycle, like the path of a toy train. Well guys, that was a lot. We're going to do a Rick and Morty breakdown every week, so subscribe for those. And while you're here, like and leave a comment. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.